Hello friends, my name is JJ. So are Western countries Christian countries? What is a Christian country? Obviously, there are lots of countries in this world with large populations of self-identified Christians, even majority populations. But calling a country Christian has become a contentious topic in recent years. Mostly, I think, because the phrase Christian country is now a slogan most associated with a particular sort of right-wing Christian activist who may not be everyone's cup of tea. Which is unfortunate because I think that this question of whether a country is Christian or not is actually a fairly complex and interesting one. And agreeing that a country is Christian in some way doesn't have to presume anything about what sort of politics that country should pursue. It all comes down to definitions, so let's look at 3 of them. So the first definition of a Christian country is the most straightforward, what we could call the theocratic definition. This is the one I just alluded to, the sort of right-wing political slogan that is probably the first thing that springs into a lot of people's minds when they hear this phrase used. Put simply, this definition argues that a Christian country is a country created by and for practicing Christian people. People who believe in the divinity of Jesus Christ and that salvation is achieved through him and his gospel. Supporters of this definition would say, you know, our country was founded way back when by devout, believing Christians, people who assume this country would always have a faithful Christian majority, and that therefore patriots and nationalists have an obligation to maintain and uphold this founding vision. Some may even go further and believe that the country itself was something explicitly created by the Christian God to be an instrument of his will on earth. Believing this sort of thing about the country offers a straightforward socio-political agenda to follow. Schools should teach Christianity, voters should elect believing Christians to public office, the Christian Bible should be used to inspire laws, Christian holidays should be officially celebrated, Christian symbols should be seen in public, and maybe even Christian citizens should have more rights than people who aren't. Or, at the very least, if the rights of Christians and the rights of some other group come into conflict, the needs of the Christians should always take priority because, hey, it's a Christian country. The worst existential crisis for a Christian country of this sort would be a decline in the number of citizens who practice Christianity, or growth in the number of citizens who practice other religions, since again, this would be the preferred metric for determining that the country was losing its essential Christianness in some way. Now, I don't think that there are many places in the modern world that are actually run according to an agenda quite this dogmatic, though certainly some politicians are not shy about claiming it as their goal.
It's time for us to position ourselves and rise up and take our place in Christ and influence this nation as we were called to do.
And indeed, like I said, we tend to associate this sort of mentality most closely with evangelical and fundamentalist Christians who are active in politics, particularly over the last half century or so. Such people are usually animated by a tangible sense of fear and anxiety about Christianity's fading popularity and power in a West that is becoming far more secular and irreligious, with fewer and fewer citizens finding the Christian religion all that persuasive or relevant anymore. So you could say that proponents of the more theocratic definition of what makes a Christian country have a vested interest in pushing the idea that the country must and should always be religiously Christian, not just because it is their sincere religious conviction that Christ's message must be spread and believed, but also because it makes themselves more politically necessary. They can claim they are not just seeking a country with more Christian people and laws and politicians for its own sake, they are doing it because Christianity forms the core of the country's identity and purpose. They are, in short, Christian nationalists. Okay, so the second definition of Christian country that we're going to look at thinks less about the Christian identity in terms of religion and more in terms of a set of secular values that have been historically derived from that religion. According to this argument, a Christian country thus believes certain things and has its politics, economy, and laws organized in a certain way, independent of whether or not its citizens accept the doctrines of the Christian faith, especially these days. So when we look at the modern West, what was once called Christendom, we can draw a few conclusions about the countries that make it up. They are generally very wealthy and entrepreneurial, home to some of the richest people and largest corporations on earth. They do a lot of trade, they have democratically elected governments, and a certain type of analyst will say that it is not a coincidence that these Western countries wound up this way and others didn't, but rather posit that this outcome is a legacy of the fact that the West was Christian and other countries were not. Now, when I say that, it is important to note that this is a religiously neutral observation. Proponents of this theory are not asserting that Christian countries have somehow turned out in a certain way because they enjoyed God's favor or whatever. The thesis simply asserts that Christianity correlates with a certain kind of society because Christianity is a religion that teaches certain things. For example, check out this book, The Victory of Reason: How Christianity Led to Freedom, Capitalism, and Western Success by the American sociologist Rodney Stark, one of the many Western intellectuals who gives Christianity the bulk of credit for why the West is how it is. And he gives that credit because he says that Christianity was very innovative as far as religions went. According to Professor Stark, what made Christianity unique was that it posited the existence of a fundamentally rational God who invited humans to attempt to understand his logic and the natural world he created. Christianity also stated that sin and salvation occurred at the individual level and were thus fates that individuals had agency over, unlike other religions, which were more fatalistic and communal in nature. Thus, the Christian religion's celebration of human agency, individualism, and rationalistic curiosity made Christian countries and the people within them uniquely inclined to pursue things like science, democracy, human rights, private property, and capitalism, since these pursuits flowed naturally from Christian teachings about the proper way to live. In conclusion, the professor writes, Christianity created Western civilization. Without a theology committed to reason, progress, and moral equality, today the entire world would be about where non-European societies were in, say, 1800, a world with many astrologers and alchemists, but no scientists. A world of despots, lacking universities, banks, factories, eyeglasses, chimneys, and pianos. The modern world arose only in Christian societies, not in Islam, not in Asia, not in a secular society, there having been none. And all the modernization that since occurred outside Christendom was imported from the West, often brought by colonizers and missionaries. As you might have been able to tell from that boastful tone, Mr. Stark is himself a Christian, but there are many secular Western intellectuals willing to make his same point. This epic book on the history of Christianity, for instance, Dominion: How the Christian Revolution Remade the World by the British historian Tom Holland, who does not describe himself as a believer. Nevertheless, he reaches basically the same conclusions as Professor Stark, saying that even the rights of unbelievers in Western countries is a product of Christian values. Secularism owes its existence to the medieval papacy. Humanism derives ultimately from claims made in the Bible, that humans are made in God's image, that his son died equally for everyone, that there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, that human beings have rights, that they are born equal, that they are owed sustenance and shelter and refuge from persecution. These were never self-evident truths. So the main argument here is that values derived from Christianity motivate the laws and governments of Western countries in a way that should always be acknowledged, even as Christianity as a religion fades as a force in those same places. Proponents of this way of thinking would thus be inclined to view a Western country that turns against, say, individualism or the scientific method as committing a greater betrayal of that country's Christian identity than they would by rejecting the divinity of Jesus. I would note, however, that even though these two scholars we looked at were pretty proud of Christianity's impact on the West, in theory, they didn't have to be. You could actually easily believe that democracy and capitalism and so on are terrible, while still crediting them to Christianity. This is actually the argument that some of the Islamic fundamentalists use. The idea that the West sucks because the values of Christianity have led it to a hideous, ruinous state that only Islam can correct. Now, the third definition of a Christian country is the one that I find the most interesting, because it understands Christian identity as something quite subtle. Christian, in this sense, doesn't describe the religious practices of a country or its ideological values as much as just the culture of the country in terms of all of the taken for granted background stuff that colors day-to-day life. In other words, even a Western person who is an aggressively anti-Christian atheist and hates capitalism and individual rights and all of the other things that these guys wrote about would still be an identifiable product of a Christian country, according to this definition, because Christian identity is taken to go far deeper than personal faith or socio-political opinions. The analogy I would make is to parents. As I get older, I am becoming more conscious of how all sorts of little random things about me, like the foods that I like, or how I think children should behave, or even the expressions that I use when I talk, are things that I fairly unconsciously absorbed from my parents. Countries are similar in the sense that their habits have also emerged from a sort of multi-generational upbringing, whose effects can be hard for people on the inside to notice, just because of how used to them they are. People from the outside, however, might notice these distinctive characteristics immediately, just as you might immediately notice how much I am like my parents after you meet them. So in our case, someone from an Islamic, Hindu, or Buddhist culture might notice all sorts of subtle Christian-inspired cultural things when he visits Europe or America that we, as citizens of these Christian countries, might take entirely for granted. Here is a fun example I heard about on a podcast the other day. Think about how food is often marketed over here. Something really delicious but unhealthy might be advertised with words like sinful or indulgent, while healthier alternatives might be marketed as being guilt-free. This sort of framing is all very Christian, because it takes for granted certain deeply ingrained Christian assumptions about how people understand and interact with bad things. Another example could be found in a political issue that we've been talking a lot about in Canada recently, which is reconciliation with the Native Canadians. The activists most interested in this issue tend to be on the secular left, and indeed might be quite hostile to Christianity as something that has been a historical force of oppression against the indigenous peoples of this continent. But at the same time, the broad guilt felt towards the plight of the Canadian Indian can be rooted in a lot of culturally Christian assumptions as well. The way that mainstream Canadian culture often heavily sentimentalizes the first peoples of the Americas as a pure and innocent civilization that was corrupted by European contact, for instance, is a very Christian framing with clear analogy to the story of Eden. Even aggressively secular people will often use Christian terms like original sin to describe these earliest crimes of our history, and take it for granted that the guilt of these sins can never be fully absolved. But even the pushback to this sort of thing is very culturally Christian too. A lot of people in this part of the world tend to really bristle at the idea that they bear collective responsibility for the crimes of the past, because this grinds against a common idea in our culture that people are only morally culpable for actions that they personally do, which again, you could say traces back to Christian theories of individual agency. In countries that come from a different religious heritage, the idea of collective responsibility might not be seen as a particularly big deal because their religious upbringing will have ingrained a more communal way of thinking. This whole way that Western people conceptualize guilt is often held up by sociologists as one of the most readily observable Christian legacies in any given society, to the point where some scholars basically just lump all of Christendom into the category of guilt-based societies. Now, if we want to get even more meta, we could say that even when Western people use religion as a metaphor, like when they say that wokeism is becoming a religion or Trumpism is like a religion, they're making a lot of very Christian-infused assumptions here too. The negative qualities that we associate with something being religious tend to be things like it being overly hierarchical or obsessed with hunting down heretical opinions, which are accusations based on specifically unpleasant stereotypes of how the Christian religion is practiced. Those analogies might make a lot less sense in, say, a Buddhist or Jewish context, but since those faiths haven't had as much historic influence over our understanding of what religion is, they don't inform how we use that term. No one is ever thinking like, You know what the problem with CrossFit is? It's too much like Sikhism. So anyway, those are a few ways to think about what it means to be a Christian country or live in a Christian country. I would be curious to know what you guys think of this term, if you think it is still a useful one, or if it has perhaps been too politicized to be helpful. If you come from a quote-unquote Christian country, I'd also be curious to hear in what sort of subtle cultural ways you think that your country's Christian heritage manifests. And if you are not from a Christian country, I would love to know what sort of distinctions people from your part of the world tend to fixate on when it comes to what makes Christian countries different. Thank you so much for watching. Do not forget to subscribe, and I will see you next week.